my name is Jess from Sallie Tomato, and today I'm here at Riley Blake Designs. I started my pattern company 8 years ago, and Sallie is my middle name, and Tomato is inspired by a pincushion. I love classic movies, and I name all of my patterns after classic movies. So today we are going to be making a beginner-friendly bag. If you've never made a bag before, the holly bag pattern is a great place to start, and I'm going to walk you through step by step on how to make this pattern. So you'll learn how to sew with contrasting fabrics such as cork and faux leather. The interior of the bag has a magnetic snap closure along with a slip pocket and a zipper pocket on the inside for extra storage. So I'll be sharing some tips on how to reduce bulk and completely assemble this bag so you have a really professional looking bag when you're complete. This is also a great pattern to feature prints or fussy cut fabrics since you have this great area for featuring special designs. Let's go over some of the materials that you'll need for this project. First of all, you'll want to grab a pattern. We've added a link below in the description so you can get a pattern to create this project. Inside the pattern are a few pattern pieces along with measure and cut instructions. You'll need 3 different fabrics for this project. You'll need a main fabric that can be cotton. You'll need a cotton lining fabric and also a contrasting non-woven fabric. And the non-woven fabric has some edges that are left raw along the accent piece and the strap. So you'll want to make sure that you're choosing either faux leather or cork fabric that can have the edges left raw. You'll also need some fleece for stabilizer to create this slouchy, structured bag. And you'll also need some hardware. We do have a hardware kit with all of the pieces that you need to make the holly bag. You'll need 2 rectangle rings, a slider buckle, and a magnetic snap. If you're using hardware at home, or perhaps you want an invisible snap closure for the closure on your bag, there's also instructions included in this tutorial for how to install an invisible magnetic snap. So just refer to the back of the pattern cover to see the full list of hardware options. There's also some optional hardware, which are bag feet if you want to add some to the base of your bag. This helps add a little bit of a professional touch, and there's only a few steps to install the bag feet. You'll also need some zippers. I'm using zippers by the yard. We will use the zipper for the interior zipper pocket. This is Sallie Tomato zipper by the yard, which has a nylon coil, so you can cut and sew directly through the zipper. And I will show you how to use zipper by the yard in this tutorial as well. So alongside your zipper tape, you'll need some zipper pulls. You'll need a few notions. I suggest a seam ripper for installing the magnetic snap and the bag feet. We'll need a zipper foot, which is helpful for installing the zipper pocket, pins, some sewing clips. A rotary punch is helpful for the bag feet, and a few marking tools and cutting tools. So let's get started on this project. I'm going to move away some of these supplies. Okay, so those are the supplies you need, and let's get started on this project. So first of all, you'll need to cut out all of your pieces according to the pattern. There are a few pattern pieces included, and then also a few pieces are measure and cut. I've already went ahead and cut out all of the pieces that I need for this project. And first of all, we need to prepare our exterior fabric with a little bit of stabilizer. This will be a slouchy shoulder bag, so I'm using a mid-weight fusible fleece for the stabilizer. And I've already went ahead and fused my fleece to the wrong side of each of my exterior pieces. So just follow whatever the manufacturer's instructions for the interfacing that you're using to fuse it to the wrong side of each of your panels. And next we're going to attach the contrast accent on the front and the back panels. So this will be out of either faux leather or your cork fabric, and you'll have one accent for the front and one accent for the back. And you'll want to use some sewing clips to hold the layers together. When you're working with faux leather or cork fabric, pins will leave a permanent hole. And plus with our fleece, it's a little bit thick, so it's nice to have the clip to hold the thickness together. So just add some clips all the way around to secure the accent in place. Next, we're going to top stitch the accent to the front and the back with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. I've already went ahead and lengthened my stitch length to 3 millimeters, so that way you can see the nice detailed stitch lines for the top stitching. So I'm going to start sewing along the inner edge of the accent. And I've lined up my presser foot so that way there's a notch that will follow right along the raw edge of my fabric for the 1/8 inch top stitching. And then we're going to pivot and sew around the bottom outer edges as well. And if your piece extends further than the edge of your fabric, that's okay. We'll trim it up so it's even at the end. So now if you flip your piece over and you need to trim any of that excess fabric so it's even with the edges, you can. And then we'll repeat for the opposite side of the bag. And I already have this done. So here's what the finished top stitching will look like, and you can set the front and back panels aside and we'll move on to attaching the magnetic snap closure. So I'm going to grab my accent pieces for my magnetic snap and my lining. And I have a few pieces prepped so I can show you the various different types of magnetic snap closures that you can add to your holly bag. So you can either attach a pronged magnetic snap closure. Otherwise, if you prefer an invisible magnetic snap closure, there's the option included in the pattern for that as well. So either way, you will need 2 of the magnetic snap accent pieces. And for the pronged magnetic snap, your hardware comes with 2 halves and also 2 washers. And you'll want to start by finding the center of each of your accent pieces. And you can do this by folding it in half both directions. I'm going to grab a pen. And I'm just going to mark on the fold about where the center will be. And then I'll fold it in half in the opposite direction as well. So where the cross marks are, that will be the center of the magnetic snap closure. And repeat for the other half. Then you'll take your washer and center it over the placement mark on the wrong side of your fabric, and use a pen or some chalk to mark each of the slits of the washer. And you'll do that for both accent pieces. Then we're going to grab our seam ripper, and I use a seam ripper all the time for installing hardware. And then you're going to cut at the top of the slit, just a small little slit at the top of each mark for the prongs of the hardware. Then you're going to take your hardware, either half, push the prongs through the slits, and on the wrong side, take your washer, add it over the prongs, and then bend the prongs away from the center to install your snap. And then you'll repeat for the other half of your snap closure as well. So I've already went ahead and completed my snap closures. I always recommend to add a piece of interfacing to the wrong side of the hardware. So I've just cut a scrap of interfacing from my stash. This is a lightweight, fusible interfacing, and centered it over the wrong side of the hardware. Then over at the iron, you can just iron directly over the hardware to fuse it in place. Just a few seconds and the interfacing will fuse, and that'll help protect your fabric. If you decide to add an invisible magnetic snap closure, then you'll center the snap on the wrong side of each of your accent pieces. And you'll want to double check that the attracting sides are facing each other. So that way your bag will close once it's installed. So just double check that the magnets are facing the correct way. Then you'll top stitch in as close as possible to the magnetic snap hardware, just about 1/8 of an inch all the way around. A zipper foot is very helpful for top stitching the snap. And then you can take a scissors and trim away any excess plastic. So it's about 1/8 of an inch from the stitching. Just be very careful that you don't cut through your stitching or your fabric. So I'm going to set my invisible magnetic snap aside and use the prong snap. So I'm going to set aside a few of these lining pieces that I have prepped because we only need one. And to find the center of the lining, we're going to fold the lining panel in half. And I'm going to quickly press to find that top edge. So you can find the center however you'd like, if you rather mark with chalk. And then you're going to measure down according to the pattern and position the top edge of the magnetic snap accent at the placement mark, right at the center of your lining. And you can use a little bit of double-sided basting tape or some washi tape to hold the snap in place. I'm just going to hold it as I sew and top stitch the closure in place 1/8 inch from the outer raw edges. And make sure to back stitch. And as you sew around the curve, make sure to pivot the foot as you go around the curve to keep an even seam allowance. So here's how the magnetic snap closure will look after you've sewn all the way around, and you'll repeat for the other half of the lining and the remaining magnetic snap closure. So I've already went ahead and completed my closure. Okay. And next we'll work on the slip pocket in the lining. So you'll grab both of your lining slip pocket pieces and place them right sides together and sew along the top straight edge, making sure that the edges are all even before sewing, and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way across the top. So I've already went ahead and stitched my 2 slip pocket pieces together. Then over at the iron, I'm going to press the seam allowance open so that'll have a nice flat finish for our pocket top edge. Then fold the pocket in half with wrong sides together and align the edges and press along that top seamed edge. Then over at the machine, we'll top stitch a 1/4 inch from the top sewn edge. Now we'll attach the slip pocket to one of your lining panels. So you can grab either of your panels for your lining and position the pocket so the lining and the pocket are right sides up. You'll align the bottom and side edges and add some sewing clips or pins to hold the layers together. And then we'll top stitch this in place. So you'll sew a 1/4 inch from the outer edges all along the slip pocket. And if you'd like, you can top stitch a vertical line up through the center of your pocket to divide it into 2 compartments, which is nice for keeping your bag organized. I'm going to move this board out of the way so that way we can use our cutting mat for marking the center dividing line. So you can take a ruler and align it with the lines on the cutting mat at the center of your bag. So earlier I had pressed that top center, and you can take some chalk or a removable pen to mark that center line and do your stitching. Make sure to backstitch at the very top edge a few times so that way you can reinforce the top edge of your pocket when you're using your pocket so it's nice and sturdy. So here's what it'll look like with the top stitching, and I decided to do 2 lines of top stitching for extra reinforcement. So once your slip pocket is attached, we will work on installing the zipper pocket next. So I'm going to grab my pieces and set these lining pieces aside. So for this project, I'm using Zipper by the Yard, and I'm going to start by showing you how to prepare your zippers if you want to use Zipper by the Yard as well. What's nice about Zipper by the Yard is you can cut whatever length of zipper that you need for your project. So you get an entire roll of zippers and then you add a zipper pull as you're ready to create your zippers. For this project, we need an 8-inch zipper. So I'm going to walk you through step by step how to add the zipper pulls onto the zipper tape. So I've already prepped my zipper, but I'm just going to slide the pull off and start with the Zipper by the Yard. And you can add the zipper on to either end of your zipper tape. So I'm just going to start with this end here and separate the tape into 2 halves. If you look at the zipper pull, there's a rounded end with 2 openings and a flat end with only 1 opening. And since we separated our zipper into the 2 halves, we're going to use the end that has the 2 openings. I find it's a little bit easier to add the zipper pull onto the tape by cutting one side of the tape shorter than the other. So I'm going to trim off about a 1/2 inch just with a pair of scissors, but you could use your rotary cutter if you wanted to. Then you're going to take your zipper pull and add it onto the longer side first, so that way it's on at least 1/2 of the zipper tape and it's a little bit easier to handle. Then you're going to guide the other half of the zipper tape into the pull, and the key is to come in at a 45-degree angle. Since this is a size number 5 zipper, it's a little bit wider coil than a typical all-purpose zipper. So angle the coil into the pull and use your finger to just push it up onto the tape, and then you can grab both ends and just slide it onto the zipper tape. So I'm going to move this board a little bit out of the way, and at the cutting mat here, I'm just going to trim off the end so it's even with my scissors. Line up that raw end at the 0 mark, and I need an 8-inch zipper. So I typically recommend to mark the size that you need. So I'm just going to use my pen, and this will get sewn into the seam allowance so you won't see the ink pen, but you could use some chalk as well. And then over at the machine, I'm going to top stitch across the zipper an 1/8 inch from each side of the marked line. And that will create some zipper stops to prevent my zipper pull from coming off. And then I also like to top stitch across the other raw end so that way my pull doesn't slide off as I'm working on assembling the pocket. So I just have my standard foot on my machine and just sew slowly across the zipper coil and make sure to backstitch. And then you'll top stitch an 1/8 inch from the opposite side of the mark. So now I'm going to cut between my stitch lines. And now I have a stitch line across the end of my zipper, so the next time I add a zipper pull on, I can slide my pull all the way down, and I already have a stitched zipper stop on my zipper tape, ready for the next zipper. So I'm going to set my zipper tape aside, and then stitch across the opposite raw edge to create that other zipper stop. Okay, so I'm going to set my extra zipper tape aside, toss these scraps. And we'll work on adding the zipper to our zipper pocket. So you'll need both of your zipper pocket lining pieces. And I have a few extra pieces here just to show the process to you. So you have 2 pieces for your lining, and you'll want to fold the bottom raw edge up 1/2 inch, so you can use your cutting mat as a guide to make sure that your bottom folded edge is up at 1/2 inch, and press it over at your iron. So you'll do that for both pieces. After you iron your bottom edge of both pieces, then we'll need to mark the placement for the zipper. So I'm going to move these extra pieces out of the way. I've already went ahead and marked the zipper placement according to the pattern, so refer to the pattern for the measurements. But essentially, you'll measure down according to the pattern and mark a horizontal line. Then you'll measure down and mark a second horizontal line, and then measure in from each side edge to mark the vertical lines. And this will create the zipper placement box. So once you have your placement box marked, now we're ready to add it to our lining. So let me grab my lining piece. And position the marked zipper pocket right sides together with your lining panel according to the pattern. So you'll measure down from the top edge of your lining, so that way the top edge of your pocket is at the placement mark and centered on your project. And then just pin the pieces together. And I'm pinning away from the placement box that I just marked, because that's where we're going to sew next. Next, over at the machine, you're going to sew along the placement box and pivot at each of the corners of the placement box. I usually recommend to shorten the stitch length to about 2 millimeters because you want a nice tight stitch for a crisp zipper pocket once we turn it right side out and add our zipper next. So now we can remove the pins. So I'm going to take those out. And we're going to cut the opening for our zipper. So I'm going to grab a smaller scissors and fold the lining in half and cut a small slit in the center of the placement box. So I usually get that started and then grab my larger scissors and cut horizontally across the entire placement box. Once you reach about 1/2 inch from the short side edge of the placement box, you'll want to angle cut up to the corner. Just be very careful that you don't cut through your stitches. Then we'll repeat for the other half of the box. So continue cutting your horizontal line, stop about 1/2 inch from the side edge, and cut at an angle out towards each of the corners. The closer you cut, the crisper your corners will be. But again, just be very careful that you don't cut through your stitches. If you happen to cut through your stitches, you could always go back and sew the outer edges a little bit wider to account for that extra little cut that happened. So it's okay, it can be fixed. So once you have your box cut, then we're going to push the lining fabric through the opening. And over at the iron, we're going to press all of these edges flat. And I usually press from both sides of the lining. So I'm going to flip it over and press from the wrong side first. It's a little bit easier to maneuver the fabric. So you can use your fingers to roll the seam edge so it stays flat. And take your time. And just press one side at a time. You can keep rolling those edges so they're nice and flat. And then I like to flip the project over and press from the right side as well, just to make sure there's no creases in the corners and everything looks nice from the right side. You also want to double check that that bottom folded edge stayed flat and didn't get creased at all. Just going to give the entire piece a fresh press. So next we'll add the zipper that we prepared earlier. A few extra zippers because I've done some work ahead of time here. I've already went ahead and added some double-sided basting tape along each of the edges of the zipper, and this will be very helpful for holding the zipper in place versus pins. I'm using an 1/8 inch wide basting tape, and you can just peel off the paper backing and then position the zipper right side up. You want to double check that your zipper pull is in the center of your zipper tape, away from where we're going to be sewing along the side edges. And now's a great time to double check that your zipper is going to be positioned how you want it. So whether you're right-handed or left-handed, I'm right-handed, so typically you'll want the zipper to open towards your dominant hand. So this zipper will open towards the right. So if you're left-handed, rotate the zipper around so that way it will open towards your left hand, whichever is comfortable for you. So the zipper is right side up, going to position our lining right side up, and you'll want to center the zipper within that placement box that we just created. You'll also want to double check that the raw edges of the zipper tape are even with the raw edges of your lining fabric. I'm just going to center it over and press down gently to adhere it to the basting tape. You want to make sure that the coil is centered within the placement box as well. And if you aren't using basting tape, you can add some pins around the outer edges to hold it in place. So I'm going to add a couple extra pins just for reinforcement. And now is a great time to attach a zipper foot or a narrow foot to your machine to do the top stitching nice and close around the zipper, around the outer edges of the placement box. I'm going to start along one of the straight edges and position my zipper foot so it will be an 1/8 inch top stitching. So make sure to back stitch. And then sew all the way around. So at the corner, I'm going to pivot, align my foot at the 1/8 inch top stitching again, and sew across the zipper. Just sew slowly, and then we'll repeat to sew around the rest of the placement box. I'm going to trim that loose thread tail and remove the pins. And here is what your zipper pocket should look like so far from the front and the back. Now we're going to attach the other half of our zipper pocket lining. So I'm going to grab my other lining piece. And place it right sides together with the attached lining. You'll want to make sure that the top and the sides are even along with the bottom folded edges. And we're going to start by sewing along the top edge. So I'm going to grab my top layers of the lining fabric for the pocket and make sure that my lining panel is out of the way for stitching. I'm going to make sure the edges are even, and you can use some sewing clips to hold the layers together or pins. And we're going to sew close to the folded edge, so it's about a 1/2 inch seam allowance or a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And leaving the zipper foot on during this step will help us sew nice and close to that folded edge. And back stitch at the end of the seam. Okay, before I sew the next step, I'm going to switch my foot back over to my standard foot. And next we're going to sew the side seams of our zipper pocket. So you'll want to fold away the right side of your lining fabric so that way you see just the lining for the zipper pocket. And you're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance beginning at the top raw edge all the way down to the bottom folded edges, making sure that they stay even. So now we'll repeat to sew the left side edge of the pocket. And this time you'll start at the folded edges and sew up to the top. So I'm going to rotate my piece around, make sure those folds are even, and sew. So here is what the final zipper pocket looks like from the front and also the wrong side. You'll want to make sure that you do not sew the bottom edge, and this will be our turning hole to turn the entire bag right side out later on. So we'll have a nice big opening to work with, and the turning opening will be hidden within the zipper pocket at the end for a nice professional finish. It's also very important that you unzip your zipper at this point, so that way we can access that turning opening later on when we're ready for the final construction of the bag. So once you're completed with your zipper pocket, you can set all of your lining pieces aside and we'll work on preparing the gusset. And similar to before, I already have some of these pieces prepped. So we're gonna start with our contrast gusset pieces. There are 2. And if you're using a directional print, you'll wanna make sure that the print is facing upwards, so that way when it curves around your bag, your print is going the correct direction. So I'm using just a solid color of faux leather, but you'll want your print to run so it faces towards the top. Place your pieces right sides together, and we're gonna sew along the bottom edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now you're going to open up your gusset and finger press that seam allowance open, and we're going to top stitch about 1/4 inch from each side of the seam that we just had sewn to help compress these layers of the faux leather. You don't want to iron faux leather or cork fabric, and even if you tried with a press cloth, it generally does not like to hold a crease or a fold very well. So that's why it's nice to have those top stitching lines to help keep everything flat. So I'm gonna top stitch from the right side of my fabric. So here's the finished top stitching. And usually I like to trim my threads as I go so everything stays nice and clean as I go along. If you'd like, now is a great time to install bag feet. So bag feet are a fun piece of hardware to elevate the bottom of your bag to keep it clean and lifted off of surfaces as you use your bag. So I've already went ahead and marked the placement for the bag feet. So this is another piece that I have prepped. Some extra interfacing ready for installing the hardware. So you'll want to mark the placement on the wrong side of the gusset for each of the bag feet. And the placement measurements are included in the pattern. So you'll measure away from the center and in from the raw edge to mark each of the 4 placement marks. So this is what the hardware looks like out of the package. There are 2 prongs on the back, and it comes with a washer. So to install the bag foot, you'll punch a hole or cut a slit with your seam ripper. I like to use a rotary punch to punch a hole through my fabric for a nice clean cut. This rotary punch is used for a variety of hardware installation, and it makes it really quick and simple to cut through thicker materials or multiple layers of fabric versus a seam ripper. So you'll want to turn the dial so that way you have your rotary punch on the smallest setting. And I use this punch for installing hardware that has prongs or screws, so it's multi-purpose. Then you'll position the punch over your placement mark and squeeze to cut the hole through your fabric. So I've already cut my hole, and you'll take your bag foot and poke the prongs through from the right side of your fabric to the wrong side and flip your project over. And then you'll place the washer over the prongs, so the prongs are through the center hole, whereas with the magnetic snap we had 2 prongs, so we placed them through the slits. This time you're only going through the center, and then bend the prongs away from the center to help distribute some of the bulk of the hardware. And now's a great time to add some permanent glue. I like Loctite brand, but you could use whatever brand you like for permanent glue, and that will help reinforce the prongs. I also have a few more scraps of interfacing that can be placed over the wrong side of the hardware to protect your bag from getting scratched from the hardware. So I'm going to quick press those into place. Just be careful as you're ironing that you do not touch the faux leather. And like I mentioned, the bag feet are completely optional, but they do elevate the look of your bag, and it only takes a few minutes to install them. So I hope you'll give them a try on your project. Next, we're going to taper the gusset. So I'm going to move this out of the way. And I've already went ahead and marked the tapered ends according to the pattern. What you'll do is you'll measure in from each of the raw edges and mark a little mark with your pen, and then you're going to measure down each of the side edges and make another mark. You'll take your ruler and connect the 2 marks to create a diagonal line, and you'll repeat for the other side of the gusset as well as the opposite end. And then you can take your rotary cutter and your ruler or your scissors and cut along each of those tapered ends. This will add a little bit of shape to the bag and make sure that the base of the bag is deep for adding all of our items inside. And trim the final edge so all 4 sides are angled. Next, we're going to attach the gusset to our front and back panels of our bag. So I'm going to grab my prepared front and back. So start with one of your panels, whichever one you want to be the front, and fold the piece in half to find the center. So I'm just going to mark the bottom center. Then with right sides together, take the exterior gusset, match the center points, and add a sewing clip. Then we're going to match up the top edges. Make sure each side is even with the top edge. And now I like to clip together the straight edges. And lastly, we will ease in the curved edges. So one more clip along the bottom here and along the side, and that will help make sure that everything is even before we ease in the curve. And you can add as many sewing clips as you like to make sure that nothing shifts while you're sewing. And if it helps to help ease the corners, if you're finding that the fabric is a little stiff, you can take your scissors and cut some small notches along the straight edge of the gusset. So you only want to cut about 1/8 of an inch into the gusset edge. Just a small little snip. So now you'll find that the fabric is easier to align around that curved edge. So if you find that helpful, then it's worth taking the extra time to add those snips. Okay. So once you have your piece clipped, we'll head over to the sewing machine and sew around the side and bottom edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And make sure to backstitch at the beginning for reinforcement. Take your time going around the curves, and if you find it helpful to use a stiletto to help hold the fabric in place, then you can certainly do so. And don't be afraid to move the fabric out of the way as you're sewing so you have a nice clear stitch line. And backstitch at the end. And now is a good time to double check that you caught all of the layers within your seam allowance, that there are no holes on the edges of your bag. So next we'll attach the gusset to the back side of the bag. Just like before, we'll fold the bag in half to find the center. Alright, so the exterior is prepped, and now we'll assemble the lining with the gusset as well. So you can set this aside. I'm going to grab my extra pieces. We're done with the rotary punch, so all of this can be set aside. And you'll want to grab your lining panels. You'll also grab your lining gusset piece, and I've already went ahead and tapered both of the ends just like before, and we'll follow the exact same steps as assembling the exterior. So you'll find the center of your gusset and each of your lining panels. We'll match the centers. And you can use pins or clips. Since this is a lighter weight fabric than the faux leather and the fleece, we could add some pins instead. So once you have 1/2 of your bag pinned, we're ready to sew. The seam allowance is going to be a little bit different than the exterior. We're going to start sewing at the top edge with a 1/4 inch and then gradually increase to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We'll increase to the 1/2 inch seam allowance once we are about 1 inch down from the top edge. We'll continue sewing with the 1/2 inch until we are close to the opposite side, and then we'll taper the seam allowance back down to a 1/4 inch. So the wider seam allowance along the side edges and the bottom will help make the lining a little bit smaller than the exterior, so it will fit nice and snug inside your bag. And right away, we're going to increase to the 1/2 inch seam allowance, angle the fabric so that way you can line up with the 1/2 inch line on the needle plate. And then continue sewing with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now that we're nearing the opposite edge, angle the fabric to go back to the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And backstitch. And next we're going to trim the seam allowance to about a 1/4 inch wide, and that will help reduce some of the bulk inside the bag. So I'm going to toss these scraps, and we'll repeat the same process to attach the opposite side of the gusset to the back side of the bag. And again, we'll trim that seam allowance to a 1/4 inch wide. Any chance that you have to reduce bulk is great for bag making. So you can double check that you caught all of the layers of the lining and set the lining aside. Next, we're going to prepare the strap connectors and attach them to the exterior. So I'm going to grab my strap connector pieces. You'll have one long piece out of your main fabric for your strap connectors. So I've already went ahead and folded each of the long edges to the center. And over at the iron, you can give it a good press. Then fold the strap connector piece in half again with wrong sides together to encase the raw edges. And over at the machine, you'll top stitch an 1/8 inch from each of the long edges. So I've already completed my top stitching. Then you're going to subcut this piece in half. So I like to just fold the piece in half, matching the raw edges, grab my scissors and cut along the fold. So it saves a few steps to make one long piece and subcut to create each of the strap connectors. Next, we'll add some hardware. So here I have 2 rectangle rings, and these will be for the strap connectors to attach our adjustable strap to the bag. So you'll thread one strap connector through the hardware and fold it in half, matching the raw edges, and add a sewing clip or a pin to hold the layers together. And then over at the machine, you'll sew across the strap connector about 1/2 inch from the folded edge. And that will secure the rectangle ring in place and prevent it from moving around. So I'm going to sew this strap connector in place. And it's important to backstitch for reinforcement. And both of our strap connectors are ready to attach. So we're done with these extra pieces. And we're going to position one strap connector against the center of each side of the gusset with right sides together. So you can leave your bag with the exterior wrong side out and center your connector over the gusset. Add a sewing clip and attach one to the opposite side as well. And then we'll baste the strap connector in place. So you can just sew right across the strap connector with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And repeat for the opposite connector. All right, so now we can take our lining and assemble our bag. So I'm going to grab my lining fabric. Now's a great time to double check that your zipper pocket is unzipped for turning the bag right side out. And you'll want to turn the lining so it is facing right side out. And place your lining into the exterior. Line up the side edges of the gusset and the entire top edge of the bag. And use some sewing clips to hold the layers together. You'll want the gusset pieces centered as best as you can. Now we'll sew around the entire top edge of the bag with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, we're ready to turn the bag right side out. So I like to grab the lining, and then you'll reach in through the unsewn edge of your zipper pocket and grab the base of your exterior and pull it through. And then just use your thumbs to push all of the fabric through the turning opening and arrange your fabric into place so you can smooth out the inside edges. I'm gonna move this and grab my stiletto. The opposite end of my stiletto has a curved edge, so if you have a creasing or turning tool or perhaps even a Hera tool, then you can use it to help smooth out the edges. So I'm just running the tool along the seam allowance to help push out the seam allowance for a nice crisp edge. Now, before we push the lining down into the bag, we have to close our turning opening. So arrange the bottom folded edges of the zipper pocket lining so they are even. You can add some pins or clips here or just align it as you sew, and sew the opening closed with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. So now you can arrange the zipper pocket in place and the lining. And I love this technique because now our opening is hidden within the zipper pocket. So if you like the zipper pocket technique, you can certainly add it to other styles of bags. So just smooth the lining down inside the bag. Now to top stitch the top edge. So you'll want to roll the top edge of the bag so the seam allowance is about a 1/2 inch below the top folded edge, and this will help conceal the lining fabric so you have that nice professional look versus having that lining fabric peek through along the top edge. So I'm going to grab some more sewing clips and clip all the way around the top. Double check that your top edges are even, and we're going to top stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so we'll end up top stitching in the ditch of the seam. So it's nice to use an open toe foot or a patchwork foot for this step so you can easily see where you're sewing. And again, since we're top stitching, I'm going to lengthen my stitch length to 3 millimeters. So our bag is assembled, and the last step is to create the adjustable strap. So I'm going to grab my strap pieces. So you'll need both of your contrast pieces for the adjustable strap as well as a slider buckle. And I've already went ahead and prepped some of the steps. Here is what the slider buckle hardware looks like for the adjustable strap portion. In order to get the length of the strap that we'd like, so it's adjustable, we have to attach a few of the pieces and join them together. So this is a very similar technique to joining lengths of binding that I'm going to show you for the faux leather. So we're going to start with 2 pieces and set one aside. And you're going to place 2 pieces right sides together, perpendicular to each other, so that way the ends overlap about 1/4 inch. Then we're going to sew a diagonal seam from the inside corner to the opposite inside corner to attach the 2 pieces together. And you can certainly mark this with your ruler and some chalk, but I'm just going to add a sewing clip and sew from corner to corner. Then you're going to take your scissors and trim the excess fabric so the seam allowance measures about 1/4 inch wide. Then finger press the seam open and top stitch 1/8 inch from each side of the seam allowance. And after you top stitch, you can trim those extra little edges of your fabric even with the sides of your strap. Then you'll repeat the same process to attach the remaining piece to create the full length of your strap. And I've already went ahead and completed this. So here is what your finished seam will look like, top stitched and trimmed. So next you're going to take the entire length of your strap and fold it in half lengthwise and add sewing clips to hold the fold in place, making sure that those raw edges are even. And when you get to one of the areas that we joined, you'll notice that the diagonal seam will help disperse the bulk, so that way the strap lays more flat versus if we were to piece the strips together end to end. So you'll continue clipping down the entire length and then top stitch 1/8 inch from the raw edges all the way down the length. Then you'll turn the strap over and top stitch along the folded edge. So I've already completed this step. So here is what the top stitch strap looks like complete. And now we're ready to add the hardware. So you'll take your slider buckle and whichever side you want to be the top side, have that facing up. The slider buckle you'll want to face right sides up as well. You'll notice on this particular slider buckle, the center slider piece is folded towards the underside, so that way you can tell which side is the right side up. And you'll thread one end of your strap through the slider buckle from the bottom, over the center bar, and back down. And you'll fold the strap onto itself, so it measures about 1.5 inches from the fold to the raw edge. And then we're going to top stitch the strap end in place. So you can either sew just a single stitch line or a double stitch line across the strap to help secure the end in place. Or if you prefer, you can sew a stitched box with an X through the center for reinforcement. It's up to you. So I'm just gonna sew a stitch line across and backstitch. And you want to trim some of these thread tails. And now we'll attach the strap to the bag. So you'll want the underside of the strap facing you. And I take my thumb and I guide it all the way down to the opposite end, so that way it keeps the underside face up. Then with your bag facing you, so the exterior is towards you and the lining is downward, you'll want to thread your strap from the lining side towards the exterior side and pull it through, so that way your adjustable buckle is closer to the rectangle ring. So now you're seeing the underside of your strap. Then take your strap, following your thumb along the underside. Make sure the undersides are facing each other and thread it back through the slider buckle. So over that folded fabric edge and down through the opposite side. Make sure that your strap isn't twisted at this point, so the undersides should be facing each other. And then making sure the strap isn't twisted towards the opposite side of the bag and thread your strap from the exterior side towards the lining side and back onto itself. So then you can repeat to do your top stitching just like before. And one final tip that I have to make sure that your bag maintains the shape that you want, to help mold the fabrics into place, you can roll the outer edges of your base and your exterior and add sewing clips all the way around. And after you have your clips attached, you can let your bag sit overnight, and that will help relax the fabric into shape. So then you'll have that really nice structured shape of the bag, and it'll maintain that over time. So here is what the finished bag looks like, all complete. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make the holly pattern. If you want to make this pattern yourself, we've added a link in the video description below that you can find the pattern. Thank you so much for watching, and if you decide to make this project, use the hashtag Sallie Tomato so we can see your amazing bag. Until next time, I hope you have a creative day. Bye.